it's always really tempting to just begin writing down everything you know, and that has its place, like in just transfer knowledge. But if you try and, once you've got to grips with the feature, figure out the kind of topic structure for it, the hierarchy, what you're going to include, when you chunk it up, what you're going to write about. And this then becomes much easier to kind of just plug content into that. You may change the structure slightly, or bits you may have missed. And doing that actually makes it easier to spot gaps as well. So what it means is it just focuses your documentation. You make sure that you're delivering the documentation that's right for your user, as opposed to just kind of what you feel you should be writing about.
Welcome to the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast, where Gowri Ramkumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Good day, everyone. Our guest today is Mark Sillings, Senior Technical Writer at Boomi. Welcome, Mark, to the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Gary. Very well, thank you. Excited to be on here. I've listened to the podcast quite a lot.
Yeah. So, Mark, I know you must have done so many things to become a senior technical writer at Boomi, but please help me understand a little bit more about yourself and also how did this whole journey begin?
Yep. My pleasure. So I've been a technical writer for about 20 years or so now, I would guess. I graduated in London, King's College London, in the late 90s. Seems like a long while ago now. With English, like in an English degree. And I sort of temped around London. And this was during the big IT boom, really, in London and the UK. So I became my first technical writing job. I kind of worked in IT jobs, but my first technical writing job was at IBM down the South Bank. And then, so I was there for a year or so. And then my wife and I, we moved down to Exeter in Devon. And I became a web designer then, which was really quite an interesting switch. Then moved back into technical writing with Capita, and then became a technical writer for a company in Bristol, like about an hour away from Exeter. And that was remote working, which actually, 15 years ago was not very common, but that was a really interesting experience and, worked really well. And I stayed there technical writing, but also doing a lot of the graphic design for the company, even developing the actual knowledge base. I think I built it in ASP and an Access database all those years ago. So quite a kind of a general experience between technical writing and design, I would say, and some e-learning along the way. I've been at Boomi for 2.5 years now. Interestingly, just before I joined, I took a career hiatus and did a PGCE in teaching. So it was something I wanted to explore. Learned an awful lot. There's a lot of crossover, ironically, or which I'd never thought there would be between technical writing and teaching. Great experience, but when Boomi approached me, it was too good an opportunity to miss. So yeah, that's where I am now.
Very nice, Mark. So I know 20 years of experience. I'm sure there's lots to discuss and share. So let's just talk about your educational background a bit more. You did mention that you have a bachelor's in English and classical studies. So what advice do you have for writers looking to transition into technical writing?
I think, I've been giving talks. We were actually, when we were part of Dell, I was working with Dell through the charity, the Talent Foundry, and we were giving talks to students, and this kind of question came up quite a bit. I think there's no set path, really. I know in the US that there are kind of degrees in technical communication, etc. It's becoming more of a field. In the UK, it's less so. So if you can't get into technical writing per se, like to begin with, try and get into a technology company. And quite often you will find technical writers within the company usually will be quite happy for some help. So you can always kind of start to branch off that way. I guess it's about learning some skills. There's lots of courses, there's forums. Write the Docs is a good kind of place to look at, like as a community. But equally, there's a lot of open source software. And quite often you can just kind of get involved in projects there and just begin writing documentation, which will teach you, you will learn from it, and you will have something to show, like when you want to try and get further into the jobs within it. So yeah, I think the other thing is perhaps, and this is one thing we really drummed into students, be open. Like you don't really, there's no kind of magic career path. Be open to opportunities and just do what you can to get into it. Don't worry about money, things like that. Just get a foot in the door somehow, and kind of grow from there.
Nice. Yeah, that's one thing we keep telling our kids as well. Don't worry about the money. The learning is the most important part.
Yeah. The money will come later, you know, but get into the field you want to get into first.
Absolutely. So what's your favorite stage of technical writing project, and why is your favorite?
It's a good question. I guess there's obviously the kind of the thrill of where it's released and you see it go out. And then there's that period where you're kind of, does this meet everyone's needs? Is this answering all the questions? So when you start to see feedback coming in saying, fantastic, this has solved everything for us. And equally, sometimes it's where things go quiet and you kind of go, well, actually, people are using it and there are no problems with it. And that's almost a good thing. Like no news is good, no news is bad news, good news. So that's obviously kind of a quick hit, as it were. But I quite like in the process, just the initial understanding, the kind of working with developers, figuring it out yourself. And when you kind of really feel like you know something and you realize that actually you're one of the few people who do fully understand something, it's quite a nice position to then teach people that, like obviously through writing. So I guess maybe that's why I looked at teaching. Perhaps I enjoy that side of things.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And I also understand that you combine your technical writing skills with graphic and web design. So tell me about the benefits of having those skills for technical writing projects, Mark.
Yeah, I think just in terms of like your own career, I think the more strings to your bow, the better. In the past, technical manuals, you think of the old ones, were technical writers would basically write this wall of text, and if there were some nice pictures, great. It wasn't necessarily at the forefront. I think, obviously, with my experience in the web and having watched it develop over 20 years, I remember it right at the beginning. When I was literally writing websites in Notepad, and you could maybe have, the days of dial-up where you could have one image maybe or two images on the page. So you really had to think about things visually. So the way the web is now, which is generally how most documentation is delivered, certainly in the kind of software side of things, it's a visual medium, and you can't just like give people this wall of text. You have to be aware. For me personally, I think you have to, and obviously this is the design side of it coming out. I'm very aware of the finished product. So it's almost like a holistic approach. So the content's great, but if the content is delivered in a way that isn't, the best, then I really that really gets to me. So I do drive people mad sometimes by becoming really involved in actually, this is great, but I think this could look better. This could be done a certain way, etc. So I think it really helps to to not just go, okay, the writing's done. I don't like to leave it there. I kind of go all the way through. And I suppose the other thing is, I always try and, you'll probably find, if you were to look at my documentation over time, you'll probably always find a couple of thkind. One is, you'll always find the phrase, for example, all over the place, because I think it's really important to give examples. You kind of will conceptually describe something, but then people need examples. But the second thing is, I always try, and particularly with new features, some kind of high level overview diagram, like a really good polished diagram. I think it just backs up that text, helps people to quickly understand something. So I have found it's kind of played quite a good part in creating docs that are just like high quality rather than just text.
Nice. That's another good insights, Mark. And can you just help us understand what's your normal documentation process at Boomi?
Yep. I mean, so So I actually am the Boomi Flow writer, which is one of the products, and I'm slightly different to the rest of the docs team. So Flow was the result of an acquisition. So I'm based in Exeter with the team there, and obviously the rest of Boomi is in the US. So I'll talk about the Flow area because that's kind of my area. I guess the process, I've got kind of two big main work streams, really. We have a legacy site refactoring project, which I've been working on for a couple of years. But the kind of day-to-day release stuff, so Flow currently, the engineering team, I'm very, I try and get as embedded as I can be within them. They currently work from like a Kanban board approach. We kind of use a CI/CD approach as well. So releases can be, between 1 and 3 times a week. So for me, I don't think I've ever experienced it. Ideally, you would always love to come in after QA, after that stage when the product's stable, etc. But realistically, in this kind of fast-moving pipeline, I'll liaise with developers right at the beginning. I'll quite often come in even kind of merge, like really early on in the stage, just to kind of keep track of what's in that release and make sure I'm comfortable with what's coming. And even, write the doc sometimes, even at that early stage without even seeing it, which obviously then you may have a bit of rework afterwards, but it just means I'm comfortable that I'm on top of the release. We work in Jira. Jira's the kind of center of our universe. So I will generally prepare my release entries within the tickets. And then when the release is ready, I'll kind of amalgamate them together into like the notifications. And that goes out within product. And then so just myself in the docs team, I have this extra bit of work because Boomi has a monthly release cycle, and I'll gather together all our kind of releases in that month and put them into the Boomi release notes as well. So, and then obviously alongside that, I suppose, is any impact on actual documentation. We use a CCMS. I may have to write some new topics, etc., or amend existing documentation. But I'll sort of do that separately. I just make sure that's in sync with the release notes. So I guess that's my kind of approach. I think it's really, I've got a great engineering team in Flow. I think it's one of the most underrated soft skills in technical writing is being able to form relationships, particularly with developers and the engineering team. So I have a great relationship with them. So I very often go to them, and they're always happy to help me out with questions, etc., or just having a look through things. I've got access to all the test sites, etc., so I can go in quite an early stage and keep ahead of things. And I think in this kind of tech docs now, like docs as code, CI/CD, things are faster. It's a much faster moving environment, and I've had to kind of adapt to try and keep ahead of things all the time, and because I think if you're not ahead, there is the real risk that you kind of delay a release, or you're just not ready in time. Yeah, so that's how I kind of work. And then the other project, the other main thing I kind of workload is its legacy site. I don't know if you want me to talk about that, or if you would prefer to kind of just stay with the day-to-day stuff.
I think just cautious of time, Mark.
Yeah, sure.
One thing we did not discuss a lot is it publicly available, your documentation, or is it a private one? Of course, what you mentioned seems to be mostly used internally, is it?
No, it's fully public. It's fully public. But I generally don't think gated documentation is I much prefer things to be public. So as I mentioned, this legacy thing. So when I joined Flow, the old site, the documentation wasn't kind of fit for purpose, and it was quite on fire with customers, etc. And anyway, through the whole process of redeveloping that and rewriting it, I've involved a lot of people like pre-sales, etc. And that's one of the things that's been really well received about new docs is that because it's publicly available, people like pre-sales, etc., can use it. They use it within the sales process. If you have, I think for them, a lot of the feedback has been, we get prospects asking us things, and And it's fantastic now because I can point them to documentation that will give them the answers rather than me trying to figure it out. So I think it's quite important to have publicly available documentation, just because it also helps the sales process. It helps lots of departments, but ours is most definitely kind of there for people to look at.
Great. So in that case, are you aware of your marketing team generating any SEOs, or is your documentation helping with the marketing team to strengthen their searches?
We don't generally use. So we have obviously marketing itself. We have community knowledge-based stuff, which is perhaps more of something that we would push and use for like lead generation, etc. So the documentation, although it does, and we write it to kind of optimize it for SEO, like, clear titles, descriptions, etc. But we don't use it as a specific kind of tool for like lead generation, etc. But it's kind of something, we bear in mind. It may be in the future that we do kind of push that angle a bit more. But primarily it's there to support customers, and stakeholders, rather than being like part of the sales process, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So shall we move on to the rapid fire round questions?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So who have you learned the most about documentation in your career?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting one. I've probably got quite an unusual answer here. So the background to that is that I've generally always worked in very small teams, or like as the sole writer. So I've never really had like a mentor or someone that I really learned from. I'm quite kind of mostly self-taught. I would actually say it was the children in the classes that I taught during my PGCE, because they taught me some really clear lessons about when you're trying to teach people, which is effectively what tech writing is, that you have to be very focused and planned and know what your learning objective is. Like if you're teaching a lesson, you have to be really clear what you're trying to teach someone. You can't just kind of teach them and hope something sticks and kind of roughly it's about this. But also, I'd say the most important thing is kind of knowing your audience and going from where they are, and rather than assuming that you know where they are. So we would, I would have like a rough week planned out, but I wouldn't plan the next day's lesson until I'd marked the books, etc., and seen where the children were. Because if half the class hadn't actually got the first day's lesson, they hadn't really got the basic concepts, there was no point in forging ahead, because you would just look immediately, that was half the class lost. So it just taught me about making sure you know your audience and making sure you write from where they are. So role-based documentation can help with this, and this may be something we start to bring into Boomi. But yeah, so I think I learned a lot about technical writing actually from teaching the young children.
Nice. So any documentation related resource you have consumed recently that you'd like to mention to our audience today?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably quite a common one. Write the Docs. So I attended the Write the Docs conference a couple of weeks ago, and all their stuff is now online on their YouTube channel. And there were some really useful talks there, some great talks, some interesting ones about API documentation, particularly, which is something we're exploring quite heavily at the moment. So they're always a good place to go. Look at their talks.
Fine. Great, Mark. So one last question for today is, what is that one piece of advice you would like to give to your 20-year-old self when it comes to documentation?
I guess similar to what I talked about, I think it's just be really organized. And by that, I mean, try and plan out your writing if you can, and equally know your learning objectives, say, to use teacher term, before you start writing a single word. Like, it's always really tempting when you go back to essays and things when I was at university, to just start writing everything down that you know. But what I found, and particularly with the legacy site refactoring, it was really important. It really helped the whole process from start to finish. Was figuring out the structure of the kind of like the topic structure. And then what you find is it becomes much easier to see the gaps when you've kind of literally planned out the topics. And then it's just a case of kind of plugging the content in. You may sort of change it a bit as you go through, but it just means you can be really focused on delivering, the docs that are right for your user, as opposed to what's right for you and what you want to write, if that makes sense. That would be the advice I would give.
Fantastic, Mark. So thank you so much for all the informations and details you shared with us today. As I mentioned, 20 years of experience, you had quite a lot of useful things to share with the audience, and anything that I have missed to ask you today as part of this podcast.
And I think it's been a pleasure. Thank you. I mean, I could go on talking forever, but I'm aware of time. So
super. So once again, all the best for all the projects you're going to be handling in the upcoming months, and many more to come again. So thank you once again, and enjoy the rest of the day, Mark.
Thank you, Gowri. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.